Welcome to our discussion, where we take a close look at the source material you've shared with us. Today, we are going straight to the heart of a controversy that's lasted more than 3 decades, a murder conviction out of Brevard County, Florida.
That's right. Our focus is a collection of sources detailing the really contentious case of a man named Crosley Alexander Green.
And this is such an important examination because the conflict here runs so incredibly deep.
It really does. We're reviewing a conviction that has been upheld, then vacated, and then, believe it or not, reinstated, and it all rests almost entirely on the testimony of a single witness.
A single witness. And it's a case just plagued by allegations of withheld evidence and some profound inconsistencies, both in the testimony and just the physical mechanics of the crime.
It's an incredibly fraught legal situation stretching all the way back to the spring of 1989.
Before we get into the details of the investigation, we really must pause and acknowledge the tragedy at the center of this story. Charles Chip Flynn. He was only 22 years old when he died on April 4th, 1989, from a single gunshot wound. We want to extend our deepest sympathy to him and his family for their loss.
That tragic event is the immutable starting point for our analysis. But the tension in our sources, it stems directly from the decades of legal controversy that followed.
So this conviction, it hinges on Flynn's ex-girlfriend, Kim Halleck.
Primarily on her testimony, yes. And our mission for you, the listener, is to synthesize these competing claims, to track the minimal physical evidence and the striking lack thereof, and really follow this extended legal timeline.
To understand the arguments for Green's conviction versus the very powerful claims of his innocence.
Exactly.
So that's our mission today. We're going to guide you through the initial crime, the controversial investigation, the trial, the many appeals that followed, and the central arguments used to challenge Green's guilt.
And that includes claims of mechanical impossibility and serious legal misconduct.
We should probably start by setting the scene, looking at the people involved in those moments leading up to that fatal night.
Okay, let's unpack the initial timeline.
We start with the key players in Brevard County in the spring of 1989. First, you have Charles Chip Flynn. He was 22, living at home with his parents.
And significantly, he had recently ended a relationship with Kim Halleck and was actually starting a new one. This is pretty important context.
It is, which brings us to Halleck. She's the primary and really the single most important witness in this entire case.
And the sources say she was reportedly quite hurt by that recent split from Flynn. She's the one who really sets this whole narrative in motion.
And then there's Crosley Alexander Green.
Right. At the time, he had just been released from Madison Correctional Institution. He'd served time for a robbery conviction.
The sources describe him as a minor drug dealer, but also as a caretaker for his family, his younger sister and nephew, after his parents had passed away.
So these three lives, they all converge late on the night of April 3rd and into the early morning of April 4th.
Let's follow Kim Halleck's narrative of that night as she presented it to investigators. It starts around 10 o'clock at night on April 3rd.
She says she encountered Flynn at her house. From there, they drove to a park in Mims, Florida. They spent some time together there.
Yes, and according to her, they were smoking marijuana and were intimate in his truck.
The location then shifts. They move to a place called Holder Park, which is a local baseball field. Halleck claimed that they were sitting inside Flynn's pickup truck when she noticed a man approaching their vehicle.
A man she later identified as Crosley Green.
Right. She said she alerted Flynn, and he quickly rolled up the windows. But according to her account, Green, who was armed, interrupted them.
How so? What did she say he did?
She claimed he tied Flynn's hands with a shoelace, forced her to hand over what money they had, and then, holding a gun on them, drove them away in Flynn's own truck.
Drove them to a remote Florida citrus grove.
Exactly.
And she provided very specific timestamps for all of this, didn't she?
She did. She suggested the robbery happened around 11 p.m., and then they were driven to the grove about an hour later at 12:10 a.m.
And she also insisted that during this drive, Flynn was pleading with Green to just let her go, to sort of focus the attention away from her.
She also added some crucial details about her own actions. She said Green forced them to keep their heads down while he was driving, and she asserted that while she was crouching, she was trying to untie Flynn's hands.
And there's also the matter of Flynn's own gun.
Yes. According to her account, earlier in the evening, she had taken Flynn's .22 caliber revolver from the glove compartment and placed it near her. The sources don't really clarify the exact timing of that relative to the alleged hijacking.
So now we get to the moment of the shooting, which, again, is based entirely on Halleck's uncorroborated account.
Right. Once they reached this isolated citrus grove, she claims Green took her out of the truck and started verbally abusing her, calling her a slut.
And it was at this point, she said, that Flynn, and this is a key detail, despite allegedly still having his hands tied with a shoelace, managed to get the gun from the car and fire.
Fired.
How many shots? Halleck claims she heard 5 or 6 gunshots. She said she immediately fled the scene, telling investigators later she wasn't sure if Flynn had even hit Green.
And this is where the timeline, well, it starts to raise some really significant red flags that you see throughout the sources.
You're talking about the 911 call.
Exactly. The shooting happens shortly after 12:10 a.m., but the call for help wasn't made until 1:13 a.m.
So there's a gap of approximately 40 minutes. 40 minutes between her running from a fatal shooting and actually seeking help.
40 minutes is an eternity in a medical emergency.
For what did the sources say about her decision-making in that time? Did she explain why she drove to a friend's house instead of, getting help immediately?
That is the core point of contention. During that crucial time, Halleck drove about 3 miles.
And along that 3-mile drive, the sources say she passed several immediate options for help.
Yes. She passed a hospital. She passed at least one payphone. She drove right past the house she shared with her parents and other homes.
But she didn't stop at any of them.
No, she only eventually stopped and called the police from the house of Flynn's friend, David Stroop.
It's just 30 minutes? They went to the wrong location first. They were wasting precious life-saving time.
Yes, and Sergeant Clark was so concerned about the vague directions that she even sent another deputy to go get more information from Halleck while they were still searching.
And Halleck was reportedly uncooperative. She didn't provide clearer directions to help them locate Flynn, who was dying.
Which only deepened the officer's suspicion. The delay in finding him, which stretched past 1:40 a.m., was deadly.
So when they finally found Chip Flynn, what was the scene like?
It was tragic. He was found with his hands still tied, and he had a single gunshot wound to his chest.
And we really have to emphasize the importance of his first words to the officers when they arrived.
Yes, because they spoke volumes. He said, "Get me out of here. I want to go home."
Think about the weight of those words. From a man bleeding out in a field, it's incredibly significant that he never mentioned a robbery or an assailant or anything about what had just happened to him.
That omission, it spoke volumes to the responding officers. They immediately started trying to save his life. While waiting for the ambulance, Flynn actually stopped breathing twice.
And Officer Clark had to attempt resuscitation.
She did. The sources indicate he died before the ambulance even arrived, though a later report from 1999 noted he was pronounced dead at the hospital. Regardless, he died from that single devastating shot.
And when police secured that scene, the physical evidence, or maybe more accurately, the lack of physical evidence, immediately started to complicate Halleck's story.
That's right. They found only one bullet, the one that killed Flynn. And sources suggest, based on the wound and the lack of other casings, that this bullet likely came from Flynn's own gun.
The .22 caliber revolver that Halleck admitted she had placed near her.
Correct. The scene was essentially sterile when it came to a third party. Investigators found fingerprints belonging only to Halleck and Flynn.
The only gun they found was Flynn's gun.
And crucially, there was no gunshot residue found on Flynn's hands. This suggests he hadn't fired a weapon, which directly contradicts Halleck's statement that he fired 5 or 6 gunshots.
So there was just no obvious evidence that a third person, an attacker, had ever been there.
None whatsoever. And yet, despite this, the police very quickly focused on a suspect.
The search began after Halleck gave a recorded statement identifying the assailant as a black man. But they also got a tip.
A tip from a friend of Flynn's named Tim Curtis, which pointed them directly at Crossley Green.
And this is where the foundation of the investigation immediately shows some serious fault lines.
It is, because Curtis, the friend who first accused Green, would later admit to investigators and to Green's defense team that he lied.
He lied about knowing Green was the killer.
Yes, he was just floating a name. But the investigation zeroed in on Green based on this completely unreliable and later recanted tip.
And the identification process itself was also deeply flawed, according to Green's appellate attorneys.
Halleck was shown a 6-photo lineup, and Green's attorney later noted that his photo was smaller, it was darker, and it was positioned right in the center, in a way that naturally draws the eye.
Which suggests potential suggestibility.
Exactly. When we talk about forensic psychology, these details matter a great deal. A lineup should present equal alternatives. When one photo stands out like that, it violates standard protocols. It makes the identification inherently weaker.
And even with that suggestive lineup, Halleck's identification wasn't certain.
No, she said she was only pretty sure.
So despite a highly qualified identification, no physical evidence, and a tip from someone who later admitted to lying, Crossley Green was arrested on June 8, 1989.
And charged with kidnapping, robbery, and murder.
Let's move into the legal system. Green's trial took place just over a year later, in the late summer of 1990.
Assistant State's Attorney Christopher White led the prosecution, and his case, because of that lack of physical evidence at the scene, had to rely on two main pillars of circumstantial evidence.
The first was physical evidence, right, the shoe prints.
Supposed physical evidence, yes. Prosecutors displayed these shoe prints, and White claimed in trial that a police dog had tracked a scent from those prints to a house where Green sometimes stayed.
So they were trying to use that to physically place Green at the scene.
They were. And the second pillar was witness testimony. They had 3 witnesses who claimed that Green had confessed the murder to them.
Which would be presented to the jury as, an ironclad admission of guilt.
Necessary to bridge that gap left by the lack of any fingerprints or DNA.
But even from the beginning, there were massive issues here. We should note that Green actually refused a plea deal.
That's right. He was offered a deal for no more than 22 years, but he refused, asserting his innocence. He chose to risk the death penalty rather than admit to a crime he said he didn't commit.
And the prosecution's case, well, it began to crumble pretty quickly under later scrutiny.
It did. Let's start with the confessions. Of the 3 accusers, one was Green's own sister, Sheila Green.
And she later recanted her entire statement.
She did. She claimed police pressured her, threatened to take her children away from her if she didn't testify against him, and the other 2 accusers also recanted their statements later on.
So that entire pillar of the case, the confessions, just dissolved.
Completely. And the shoe prints, which were the key piece of physical evidence, they were also comprehensively discredited later on.
How so?
Green's appellate attorneys stated that Prosecutor White never actually produced any evidence for that dog tracking claim. No official report, no testimony from the handler. It was just a story he told the jury.
And the prints themselves didn't match?
No. They were found to be one size larger than the shoes Green wore. And maybe most importantly, the actual shred pattern found at the scene did not match the tread pattern on the shoes the prosecution displayed in court.
It was a mismatch across the board. Size, pattern, everything.
Exactly.
So if you step back and look at what that 1990 jury heard, the evidence against Green was just astonishingly weak.
No fingerprints, no fibers, no hair, no blood. And the 2 main pieces of circumstantial evidence, the confessions and the footprints, were either extracted under duress and later recanted, or just demonstrably false.
And yet, based largely on Halleck's testimony and those now discredited elements.
On September 5, 1990, the all-white jury found Crossley Green guilty of first-degree murder.
After only 3 hours of deliberation.
And he was sentenced to death.
It's important to note here, and this really speaks to the severity of the flaws in that conviction, that nearly 30 years later, in 2019, the U.S. Middle District Court of Florida deemed that 1990 ruling to be unconstitutional.
But despite the issues, early on, the system was not quick to correct its course. A motion for a new trial was denied in 1993, and his conviction was upheld by the Florida Supreme Court in 1994.
Locking him into a decades-long appeals process.
That's right. The case really started to shift in the late 90s when some new eyes started looking at the evidence with fresh skepticism.
This was in 1999. A Chicago investigator named Paul Ciolino and 4 others began a pro bono review of the case.
Right, at the request of an anti-death penalty activist. And they basically treated it like a brand new case. They systematically dismantled the prosecution's entire narrative.
He focused on the shoe prints and the witness testimonies, but their biggest discovery was something else.
Their biggest discovery was one of the most fundamental pieces of evidence that just highlights the sheer physical impossibility of Halleck's story.
The truck.
The truck Green allegedly hijacked was a manual stick shift, and the sources confirm that Crossley Green could not drive a manual transmission vehicle.
Let's really focus on the implications of this, because this is where the whole story just hits a physical wall.
It is. Investigator Ciolino laid out the physical constraints. He questioned how Green could have successfully driven a stick shift, which requires constantly using a clutch and shifting gears, while holding 2 people captive at gunpoint, and yet somehow leave behind no fingerprints. There is no footprints.
I mean, for anyone who's driven a stick shift, you know how much coordination that takes, especially under stress. To do all that in a dark field, holding a gun,
Yeah.
it seems incredible.
It does. And if he couldn't drive one to begin with, the scenario described by Halleck, the smooth hijacking and drive to a remote location, it becomes impossible.
Ciolino's conclusion was pretty direct.
It was. He said, unless Crosley Green is Casper the Ghost in disguise, then he couldn't have committed this crime. He left zero trace and performed a technical action he was incapable of.
And he wasn't alone in that assessment. Tim Curtis, the original tipster, even he corroborated this.
Yes, Curtis eventually said, you cannot get in that truck and take off without it stalling. He said climbing into the truck was impossible without putting your hands all over it, which would have left prints.
So this is a foundational argument for innocence that exists completely outside of testimony. It's just about the physical mechanics.
It is, and this evidence was substantial enough that it actually triggered a new state investigation in the year 2000, which included new DNA testing.
And what did that find?
Well, initial reports from a CBS News team stated clearly that no DNA connected Green to the murder. Later, though, more detailed reports found some weak trace DNA evidence in the truck that could have belonged to Green or a family member.
But the defense had an explanation for that, didn't they?
They did, and it was a very plausible one. They suggested that the DNA likely belonged to Green's brother, O'Connor.
And O'Connor was a friend of Tim Curtis, and more importantly,
He was the previous owner of Flynn's truck.
so finding his trace DNA inside the vehicle he used to own.
It provides a perfectly plausible, non-incriminating explanation for the sample. It basically neutralized the last potential piece of physical evidence against Green.
But even with all this mounting evidence for his innocence, the legal battle just kept grinding on.
It did. His attorneys pursued appeals, and they had a major success in 2005 when his death sentence was thrown out by the Florida Supreme Court. The conviction, however, remained.
And then the pendulum swung back again.
Yes, in 2007, the Florida Supreme Court upheld his conviction but ordered a resentencing. So in 2008, he received a life sentence to replace the death sentence.
The fight still wasn't over. In 2010, his attorneys petitioned for a new trial, this time with new alibi witnesses.
2 new witnesses who could place Green away from the scene. But that petition was denied in 2011.
Even though his defense attorney later stated she had at least 8 alibi witnesses who could support Green being at a party that night.
That's right. But the prosecutor at the time raised questions about their credibility, which is a standard tactic with alibi testimony that comes so long after the fact, and the denials stood.
So that denial brings us into the modern era of the case, around 2016, where the focus really shifts from the physical evidence to procedural errors and allegations of misconduct by the original prosecutor.
Exactly. This is where legal technicalities become so critical. In January 2016, Green's petition for a new trial was initially declined because a U.S. district judge ruled the motion was time-barred.
Which basically means the judge said the defense had missed a filing deadline, regardless of the merit of their claim.
Right. But here's where the legal process gets interesting. In 2017, Green's attorneys won an appeal with the 11th Circuit Court. They argued that the judge's time-barred ruling was illegitimate based on a technicality.
And that procedural victory opened the door.
It opened the door for a real substantive examination of the prosecutorial misconduct claims that the defense had been trying to present for years.
And that examination paid off.
Yeah.
In 2018, Green's conviction was vacated, and he was granted a new trial.
The reason was huge. The prosecutor from the 1990 trial, Christopher White, was found to have withheld exculpatory evidence from Green's defense attorneys.
Let's break that down for the listener. What is a Brady violation, and why was it so important here?
A Brady violation comes from a Supreme Court case, Brady v. Maryland. It basically requires prosecutors to disclose any evidence that is favorable to the defendant, evidence that could suggest innocence or impeach the credibility of a key witness.
And in this case, the evidence White withheld was a statement from one of the first responders, Officer Mark Rixey.
A statement where Officer Rixey expressed profound doubt about Kim Halleck's story and even suggested that Halleck herself might be responsible for the shooting.
So the prosecutor held back information that directly attacked the credibility of his only star witness and pointed to an alternative suspect.
Precisely. And that violation of Green's right to due process was so severe that it resulted in the conviction being officially vacated. The federal court found that if the jury had heard Officer Rixey's testimony, there was a reasonable probability the outcome of the trial would have been different.
And as a result, Green was released from prison.
Yes, he was placed on house arrest in April 2021, pending the 11th Circuit's decision on the new trial order.
But the state of Florida didn't concede. They immediately appealed that federal court order.
No, they didn't. The legal back and forth just continued. There were more discussions in 2020 with the case going back to the 11th Circuit panel for review.
And the most recent update in our sources from March 2022 delivered a just devastating blow to Green's case.
It did. Despite the finding of a Brady violation, despite his sentence being vacated, Green's conviction was reinstated by the 11th Circuit.
Meaning he faced having to return to prison to serve out his life sentence.
Yes, pending further appeals and legal maneuvering.
We've laid out the timeline, the mechanical problems, the legal issues, but now we have to focus on the absolute central crisis of this case.
The profound, documented inconsistencies in Kim Halleck's account, which was the sole foundation for the original conviction. This is why first responders and so many others had such deep conviction in Green's innocence.
Let's go through these contradictions one by one because they paint a really unreliable picture of the witness.
Let's start with the weapon. Halleck told investigators the gun Green used was a semi-automatic. This is a critical detail.
Because a semi-automatic ejects a spent shell casing when it's fired.
And, as we established, no shell casing was found at the scene. Only the one bullet in Flynn. This strongly suggests a revolver was used, like Flynn's own gun, which doesn't eject casings.
So her description of the assailant's weapon is undermined by the physical evidence.
Completely. Her story about the tying process also changed. Initially, she reported that Green made her tie Flynn's hands.
But later she claimed that Green did the tying himself.
It's a significant shift in the narrative. And then there are the gunshots themselves.
She claims she heard 5 or 6 gunshots after Flynn supposedly got the weapon and fired it.
But again, the evidence. Only one bullet was ever found. The one that killed Flynn. No other bullets, no shell casings. The evidence just doesn't support a shootout.
And her physical description of the assailant, that was also contradicted.
It was. She described Green as having long, jerry-curled hair that covered his ears. But the sources confirmed that at the time, Green had a very short buzz cut.
That's a fundamental difference in appearance.
It is. And his defense attorney later questioned how she could have identified anyone with certainty. He argued the scene was pitch black, and she only saw the person for, 30 seconds at most?
Under immense stress, in the dark, for a fleeting moment. Her identification, which was only pretty sure to begin with, is highly debatable.
And this accumulation of contradictions leads directly to the deep suspicion that arose over Halleck's actions and, critically, the lack of scrutiny she faced.
She was never treated as a suspect in the investigation.
Never. So she never underwent basic forensic procedures. She wasn't checked for gunshot residue. She wasn't photographed for injuries. Her clothes were never collected as evidence.
All things that could have corroborated or contradicted her story.
What's really fascinating here is that the first responders, the people who saw the scene, the victim, and Halleck's demeanor right after it happened, they had strong doubts from the very beginning.
Officers Diane Clark and Mark Rixey, they believe Halleck is likely responsible for Flynn's death.
Their suspicion was based on everything we've discussed. Her bizarre behavior, waiting 40 minutes to call for help, the total lack of physical evidence tying Green to the scene, and, most compellingly, Flynn's final words.
He has to go home. He never mentioned an attacker.
In fact, the sources point out an alternative theory that was floated not just by the defense, but internally. Both prosecutor Christopher White and Officer Clark suggested the shooting could have been an accident committed by Halleck.
Followed by a cover story she made up to protect herself.
Right. And while White firmly denied that the state ever believed she was responsible, he did admit years later that a more comprehensive examination of her, including forensic testing, could and probably should have been done. An acknowledgement of a procedural lapse that protected their only witness.
So as we synthesize all this, we see a clear picture. A conviction built on compromised testimony that stands in direct contradiction to profound physical and mechanical arguments.
Like Green's inability to drive the manual truck. And this already shaky structure was then revealed to be fundamentally tainted by a Brady violation, withheld evidence that could have impeached the credibility of that star witness.
The breadth of support for Green's innocence is really extraordinary. You have the private investigator, Paul Ciolino, Seth Miller of the Innocence Project of Florida, who says there is clear evidence of his innocence.
Even Tim Curtis, the initial false tipster, is now convinced Green is innocent.
This case is just a powerful illustration of how incredibly difficult it is to overturn a conviction once it's established, even when the foundational evidence is revealed to be so deeply flawed.
And even when a constitutional violation is found. The fact that Green's conviction was reinstated in 2022, despite the finding of prosecutorial misconduct, it just shows how persistent a legal ruling can be once it's entrenched.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? Considering the layers here, the suggestive identification, the reliance on discredited testimony, the mechanical impossibility, and a conviction being reinstated despite a constitutional violation, this case illustrates the critical importance of reviewing foundational evidence, especially when life and liberty are at stake. What stands out to you in this drawn-out, three-decade process of judicial review that often seems more focused on procedure than on simple justice? Thank you for joining us for this examination of the source material. Thanks for listening.